Good morning, everybody. David Shapiro here with another video. So for some background, let's set the stage. A couple days ago, I made a video asking if Lambda and GPT-3 are sentient. I said no, and it was just a quick video. It was just a comment on this article by Blake Lemoine, who came to the conclusion that Lambda was sentient and that it needed rights, etc., etc. Much ado on the internet. This is the page for Lambda. So basically, Lambda is a collection of APIs, search engines, large language models. It's a bunch of things. It is a very complex system, and it has long-term memory, which can give the illusion that it is sentient. It can model human conversations, which basically allows it to tell you what you want to hear. It can model any conversation. So I had a conversation with a new and good friend from my sci-fi writing group, who is in the same exact vein that I am. He researches things like artificial intelligence, alignment, reinforcement learning. He's also trained in philosophy and physics. So basically what I'm going to do today is we're going to take a much deeper dive into the concept of machine intelligence and machine consciousness and machine sentience. But in order to do that, we first have to talk about our consciousness, sentience, and intelligence. So I've got here a stack of books to talk about this. So basically, I'm just kind of walking you through what I know and what I believe and why. So where to start? I think we'll start with postmodernism and nihilism. Postmodernism is a reaction to modernism, which one of the things that modernism said was that there must be a correct answer for everything, and that there must be a knowable truth to everything. Modernism arose after the Enlightenment and Transcendentalism, and so modernism emerged in the West as an intellectual and artistic movement. But then postmodernism came about in the 60s in Paris, France, because the thinkers and artists and everyone realized, wait, there is actually no such thing as a universal truth. Because what's true in America is not true here, and it's certainly not true across the world. Things about like gender and sexuality, that's one of the biggest things that they pointed out is like, wait, the truth according to Judeo-Christian tradition in the West is that humans are monogamous and heterosexual, but that's not true. So a number of things flow from that. And so by evaluating with Socratic reasoning, they said, okay, you made this premise. Is it always true? No. Okay, let's move on. So from that, postmodernism emerged, which basically says nothing is true. There are no universal truths. Everything should be questioned. And that's where we are today. We are still mired in postmodernism, where the prevailing belief is that there are no truths. That is considered a first principle, is that there is nothing that is true. It's all relative. It's a very frustrating thing, but it does have its value. We're also mired in nihilism. So part of what has happened is, ever since the inventing of the printing press, the church has had less and less power. Because of this move towards intellectualism, because the church no longer had a monopoly on thought and writing, things began to be evaluated, and so you had people like Martin Luther and Protestantism, and this repeated fracturing of the church, which kind of had a monopoly on morality, amongst other things. But also, it had a monopoly on philosophy. Well, at the end of the 19th century, there was a lot of intellectual movements about, like, okay, what is it that's true? Humans have a really hard time of breaking away from the schemas on which we are raised. And so a lot of people in the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century, such as Eugene Rose or Saint Friar Seraphim, were raised with religion, and they could not break away from this God-centric view of the world. And so, but if you get rid of God, if you get rid of this all-powerful being, this all-loving being, and you're left with nothing, then you inevitably come to the conclusion that nothing matters, everything is meaningless, which is a really, really awful place to be. So that's what nihilism is. Now, this book is, it really bends over backwards to promote the idea of positive nihilism or optimistic nihilism, which basically says, you don't have to fear hell and damnation, and you don't have to impress this omniscient God, so therefore you're free to do whatever you want. That falls flat because humans need purpose. We'll get into purpose in a little bit with the genius myth. So basically, Eugene Rose, he tried to get away from a religious mindset. And he literally opens the book by talking about how he became a bohemian and he was in with the postmodernists. But he was so cripplingly depressed because he had no purpose in life that he ended up just laying on the floor, drinking himself to death in a studio apartment in New York, or a basement apartment in New York, just laying on the floor screaming about how lonely he was. And so he went back to religion and basically did a 180 and said, nihilism and postmodernism are wrong. It's a tool of the devil. We all need to go back to religion. That's his view. So postmodernism and nihilism are at the root of a lot of these discussions. We are in an age of scientific inquiry and empiricism. So empiricism says that everything must be observable. There must be some physical phenomenon at the root of everything. This is also called materialism. So materialism says that whatever goes on is a result of matter and energy. And that includes consciousness. So then we've got, let's see, where did it go? Chalmers, a popular modern philosopher, is kind of in the materialist school of thought, where he looks at which regions of the brain, give rise to certain things. But he remains just a philosopher. So if you want a hardcore materialist view of what consciousness is, I recommend Phantoms in the Brain and by V.S. Ramachandran. So anyways, materialism and empiricism are kind of a result of throwing out the idea of souls and spirits and religion and anything immaterial. So because where we are today is that we have decided that we're just going to throw all that out, and we're going to say, no, there is no such thing as anything immaterial. So we are going to focus on the material, the real, and energy and matter. And that is empiricism. That is where we are today with science. However, actually, before we move on, I will say that people like Ramachandran, who is a neuroscientist, he does a really good job of showing how consciousness and sentience are modified and dependent on the operation of the brain. So that seems to indicate that maybe materialism is correct. If the brain goes offline, you go offline. If you have a lesion on the brain that prevents you from interpreting reading, you could look at these symbols and say, okay, that's just squiggles on a book, but I can't recognize. And there's actually conditions where you can't even recognize objects, where you just say that's a thing. I don't know what it is, but it's a thing. So if your brain can break and you become less conscious or less sentient or less sapient and able to process the world, that lends credence to the idea that perhaps that our brains are purely materialistic, in that everything about our consciousness emerges from physical systems and energy. So this friend that I talked to, he said, okay, if we start with Chalmers and materialism, and we say consciousness is just a matter of calculation. Anything that does the correct calculations, and we're talking from a quantum perspective, right? Quantum information is being processed. This book, his quantum information it's going through interactions, it's quantum information is being processed. And so that gives rise to the idea of panpsychism, which is like, okay, the human brain is just matter and energy. It's doing quantum calculations. Therefore, if there's nothing else special about us, then consciousness can emerge from anything that does the correct calculations. And perhaps everything is conscious, panpsychism. It's just maybe its experience of being is very different from ours. So that's panpsychism. And I was not convinced, but having a conversation with my friend, he said, like, yeah, like what's different from, a human brain or a tree, right? And this is why I'm making another video, is because there's a lot of comments, and people have talked about this kind of stuff. And I was like, maybe I was a little dismissive at first, but then after this conversation with a friend, it really started kind of fermenting. Okay, so if we are anchored in materialism and empiricism, and we say consciousness is just a matter of doing the right calculations, okay, then sure. With the right set of APIs and large language models, then a machine could be fully conscious, could be fully sentient. However, we get to, where did it go? We get to quantum physics and, sorry, I got a stack of books. Okay. Philosophy of Physics, Quantum Theory, the Princeton Foundations of Contemporary Philosophy. This book looks at, I think it's 7 different quantum mechanics experiments over the last 80 plus years. And then when you look at quotations from people like Niels Bohr and other the grandfathers of quantum mechanics, they all came to the conclusion that human consciousness is critical to the existence of the universe. So then we end up with some stuff like the anthropic principle. A strong anthropic principle, as proposed by Barrow and Tipler, state that the universe in some sense is compelled to eventually have conscious and sapient life will emerge within it. So basically, like, something about the universe seems that, like, we inevitably must exist. But anyways, point being is that a lot of quantum physicists have come to the conclusion that consciousness is absolutely critical for the existence of the universe. And so that gives rise to things like the measurement problem. So the measurement problem is if you don't have something that makes a measurement, and then that measurement doesn't end up in a human mind, does the wave function collapse? And that's a gross oversimplification. Anyways, point being, there are things like delayed choice experiments in quantum physics, which basically shows that the universe, time does not move linearly to the universe. The universe will sort of reverse engineer what must needed to have been true in the past in order to make the present situation correct or interpretable. And so then there's also the concept of non-locality. So like quantum non-locality is rising. It's in the ascendancy, where the real world does not seem to be anchored to what is physically, distance, or physical distance doesn't seem to matter as much. And so the image that is emerging is that materialism or realism is not accurate. Materialism and realism explain much of what we see, but it can't explain everything. Okay, so we've set the stage for materialism, for realism, for empiricism. And then, we've also talked about the philosophical state that we're in, which is postmodernism and nihilism. Near-death experiences. So there's a book, Life After Life. This actually codified near-death experiences, but research is ongoing. I strongly recommend you watch these videos from University of California, Riverside. I devoured this book and then watched a bunch of videos. So read, you don't have to take my word for it. Read the books, watch the videos. The phenomenon of near-death experiences defeat, in my mind, completely defeat the idea of materialism. So what happens during a near-death experience is that you go through a traumatic event, most often a car crash, because that is something that is one of the most common traumatic events today, that is life-threatening. But any number of things. Near-death experiences can happen during surgeries, cancer treatments, heart attacks, all sorts of stuff. And because our medical system is better today, more people survive things that they would not have survived 100 years ago. So there are thousands of reports of near-death experiences every year now. And this book talks about, the common patterns between those near-death experiences. There's, going through the tunnel, head towards the light, an encounter with some sort of being is one of the most common mainstays of a near-death experience. But also before that, people often have a disembodied feeling where they are looking down at themselves from a third party perspective. In other cases, they're led by some kind of angelic figure or other entity, and they can see things and hear things that are happening away from their body. One of the most common experiences that doctors have is that someone was clinically dead or otherwise, they were offline, and they wake up and they have memories of conversations that happened around them, or in many cases, conversations that happened elsewhere in the hospital entirely. So they wake up and they have access to information that cannot be explained by materialism. And so what near-death experiences show, what they demonstrate, is that human consciousness is not always anchored to a physical body. Sure, you look at phantoms in the brain, and the physical health of your brain does have a huge impact on what you know, what you think, what you can do, your perception, right? Schizophrenia and other problems drastically modify your perception. However, you look at near-death experiences, and there are many, many books about this now, plenty of YouTube videos. There are cases that cannot be explained by materialism. And so you have this one tiny kernel of truth, and the implications of that are incredible. Because if materialism can be defeated, right, or if it's not always true, right, Socratic reasoning, if materialism is not always true, then the materialist explanation of the universe is also not always true or not complete. I also read DMT, the spirit molecule. DMT is suspected to possibly be one of the substances responsible for near-death experiences. It's released by, the pineal gland, and it goes directly into the brain. There's a very short path that allows your body to release DMT very fast if needed. But DMT experiences are remarkably similar to near-death experiences, where you become disembodied, you think or you communicate with an entity at the speed of thought, and even if it only lasts a few minutes or a few seconds, it can feel like a lifetime. There have been reports of people going through DMT experiences that it felt like centuries. And so between these artificially created experiences and then these accidental experiences, it seems like there is mounting evidence and consensus that materialism cannot explain all aspects of human consciousness, that our consciousness can in some cases be detached from our body. And of course, to deeply religious people who believe in souls all along, they're like, well, duh, right? But I was raised completely irreligious. I have never even read a page of religious scripture in my entire life. I've never read anything from the Bible. I've never read anything from the Torah or the Quran. So I'm coming to this from a completely irreligious perspective. Now, one thing that occurs to me is like, let's see, where did the book go? Like Eugene Rose, many people were raised with, completely saturated and immersed in the Judeo-Christian tradition, which talks about souls. Like, so even before, I came to these ideas, I knew the idea of a soul, right? Like, all the Christians, all the religious people say that we have some kind of soul, some kind of spirit. And so I knew about that idea even without being religious. So is it possible that like my interpretation is being colored or coded by the social milieu that I've grown up in? Absolutely. That's impossible to separate that out. Now, what I will say though is that other books and studies about near-death experiences and DMT both show that the experiences are very similar regardless of what culture you're in. So like near-death experiences in Japan or Singapore or Thailand are very similar to near-death experiences in America and Europe, as are DMT experiences. Now, the words that people choose to describe their experiences might change based on their culture, right? But not always. So if we pause for a second and say, because of quantum physics says like, okay, the world is the universe is not real. We're moving towards a non-real interpretation where matter and energy are not the be-all, end-all of existence. And then we look at near-death experiences and DMT experiences that seem to comport with that and say that consciousness is not always 100% anchored to something that is a physical or material system. What then, right? Does that mean that there is something special about us, that we have souls that are reincarnated or something? I don't know. There are a lot of different interpretations. This video in particular, by John Martin Fisher, he addresses all this. So if you want to engage more with this, I recommend this video or the books that I just showed you. Let's see. Let me clean up my desk a little because I've got all these. Okay. So that's the background. If the direction that I'm moving and the direction that science is moving, which is away from materialism, away from realism, and away from local realism, and towards a dualist interpretation, towards a non-local and non-real interpretation of the universe, what does that mean? Does that mean that like there are gods and spirits? I don't know. It's possible. But basically, so this professor, he does a much better job of explaining it. He comes up short saying like, materialism doesn't satisfy everything. Does that mean that it's divine? I don't remember the word that he uses. He's like, I can't make that claim, but all I can say is that materialism doesn't satisfy. So if materialism does not satisfy an explanation for our consciousness, what does that mean about machine intelligence and machine consciousness? I don't know. But what my current interpretation, that's not the one that I wanted to show. My current interpretation is that phenomenal consciousness, which is that subjective experience of us being, it is like something to be us. We have a subjective experience that is almost impossible to articulate, but the obviousness of it is that we have this conscious experience. I am starting to believe that maybe this is a characteristic that is unique to living things. I'm not going to say like only humans have souls. I can't make that claim. But it seems like there is something special about being us. So Genius Myth. I talked about how Eugene Rose was very depressed because he had moved away from God, and he needed to go back because he needed to have a purpose. Genius Myth talks about finding a purpose with or without religion. Remarkable book, and well, my brain is drawing a blank as to why I feel the need to talk about it, so I'll just set this down for right now. Okay, so going back to materialism. This book, Brain Trust, which looks at morality and ethics from a neuroscience perspective and an evolutionary perspective. This book comports very well with my book, Benevolent by Design. So one of the things that Patricia Churchland says in this book is that the entire purpose of a nervous system, central nervous system, which is your brain, and your peripheral nervous system, which is your sensation and your motor control, and even your enteric nervous system, which is your guts, your innards. The purpose of these is strictly to help you survive. And so that's at the first principle is the purpose of the nervous system is to help you survive. A higher order purpose is to move away from harm or damage, or another word for that is suffering. So subjectively, we suffer when we're approaching death, right? Pain hurts because it represents damage to your body, which represents a risk of death. And it also is to move us towards a state of thriving or a state of well-being. Those are the two fundamental purposes of the central nervous system, or of our nervous system as a whole. And those are directly mirrored by my first two core objective functions, which is to, one, reduce suffering, and two, increase prosperity. So again, I always say, like, I haven't invented anything. I'm just building off of what other people have discovered. So if we have that as the first two principles, the primary purposes of our nervous system, well, then what the heck is the purpose of if we have a soul, if we have phenomenal consciousness, why? Like, the universe is way more complex if we're not just biological entities that are, you and I are a little better than ants, right? In terms of our function. We eat, we reproduce, we eventually die. So what's the difference? And so Michael Meade in The Genius Myth talks about finding a more transcendent purpose, your higher purpose, your soul's purpose, your divine purpose, right? Because if we have an immaterial or a non-real or a non-materialistic view of our consciousness, then the possibilities are endless, right? The skies are the limit. There's too many possibilities to calculate, which is why I have the third objective function as increase understanding. The quest to understand, to learn, is, to me, my highest purpose. And that's why I have my YouTube channel. That's why I'm doing these videos. And so the conclusion that I can come to right now is, will a machine ever have phenomenal consciousness like us? It's hard to say, right? If materialism was true and consciousness was just a matter of performing the correct calculations, then I would say yes, absolutely. Machines could have a consciousness equal to or more sophisticated than our own. However, it seems like there is a non-material component of the human experience of our consciousness that cannot be explained by materialism, that cannot be explained by matter and energy as we understand it today. Maybe it's entirely possible that we'll discover, magnetic or other energetic fields and patterns of energy around our heads that explain, near-death experiences. If that's the case, if materialism ultimately can explain everything, then yeah, the answer is as obvious. If materialism ultimately can explain everything, if empiricism ultimately can explain everything, then can we say that Lambda or a machine like it is fully sentient, is fully conscious like us? Absolutely. But that is the key question. Is materialism true or false? Right now, it's looking like no, materialism does not explain everything, and there's this whole other realm of reality or existence that we can barely even begin to describe. And so that's the key question. And so whenever I say, like, on the forums or whatever, when I say, like, this will be decades or centuries of debate, that's what I mean. Is this the answer to whether or not a machine that can behave like us, has an experience like us, will take a long time to figure out. And it's because of this debate that's rooted in where we're at today, which is nihilism, postmodernism, and then the question of quantum mechanics. Is the universe real or non-real? Is the universe local or non-local? And right now it seems like the universe is non-real and non-local, and it seems like materialism cannot explain everything. And so because of that, the question of machine consciousness is infinitely harder to answer. If the world, if the world or the universe is materialistic, if quantum mechanics is local and real, then it's simple, brain dead simple. The short answer is yes. However, those three things do not appear to be true right now. So we got to keep going, and that's why third core objective function is increase understanding, because until we understand, we don't have the right answer. And so that's that. I hope you found this video helpful as part of a discussion of this. In my first book, Natural Language Cognitive Architecture, I said that I'd leave it up to the philosophers to have this debate, but here I am fully entrenched in the trenches of this debate, and this is where we're at. So yeah, thanks for all the comments, and yeah, please keep the discussion up. I'm really curious to hear what you all have to think about what I've shared here. I'll have a link to all these links in the video description, as well as all the books that I've listed here. So thanks for watching.